Susanne, Mrs. Powlesland, for services to black and minority ethnic people in East London.
Sometime in life you feel so upset. In that moment, please don't forget. One day soon you'll be back on your feet.
My father was a watchmaker and jeweller and had a big jewellers and watchmakers shop. We were pretty well off, I guess, and had a nice flat, big shop with some employees. Quite a good life, I guess. We spent quite a lot of time in the countryside. We used to go on trips every Sunday. Father had a sister who lived somewhere out in the countryside, and she had a big traditional Austrian farmhouse. And what I remember as a child was her big cherry tree, big, you know. And she had 2 big barrels outside the back door with sauerkraut ripening. So that was a traditional Austrian thing to do. Yeah, later on they came to England and lived in a little flat in Birmingham, but they got very despondent and ended up committing suicide together. Sealed all the doors and windows and turned the gas on. That's much later. So there I was having this nice life in Austria. I was an only child, didn't have any brothers and sisters. And then I remember after the Nazi time, when it was obvious that being Jewish was a great disadvantage. And I remember having to wear a yellow star sewn on my coat sleeve that I had to wear whenever I went out. And I had to stop. My ordinary state school couldn't take Jewish children anymore. So I had to leave that. And I remember looking out of the window of our flat. We were on 2nd, 3rd floor up, and seeing the soldiers, the Nazi soldiers, you know how they used to goose step? And they were goose stepping past great masses of them. And I had a strong sense as a little girl of justice and fairness. And I thought all this is all quite wrong at the age of 8.5, I suppose I was. And I thought what I'll do is I'll put a notice in the newspaper and I'll tell all the Jews to get together and we'll all go together, all the Jews, and we'll tell the Nazis that what they're doing isn't fair and it isn't right and to stop it. But somebody or other dissuaded me from doing this. So eventually, even my father, who I think kept thinking all the while it'll all blow over, this can't possibly be happening. Even he got the message in the end, I think, and decided to emigrate. But of course, all the European countries and America had shut their doors to Jewish people and wouldn't let anybody in unless they had a real good sponsorship of somebody from that country who could show that they'd be able to put them up, find them somewhere to live, and provide basic essential food for them, so that the host country wouldn't have any responsibilities. Now, my mother was a theosophist, so she got in touch with the theosophists in England to see if there was anybody who would sponsor our family. And there was. So by this time it was getting a bit late. Most of our relatives had already left. My father, I suppose it was hard for him. He found it very hard to give up his lifelong work of getting, good business together and all his belongings and everything he'd built up in all his life. So in the end, all we were allowed to take with us was one suitcase each. And I think those suitcases mainly had clothes. They had a few odd bits of belongings. And also in Austria, my father was a keen photographer, and he couldn't bear to leave all his photos of me behind. So he took a large collection, must have used up quite a bit of space in that precious suitcase, a large collection of photos of me as a little girl. And so we came to England. Well, we left, it later turned out, on the last train that was allowed out of Vienna. The next train, that, it didn't only have Jewish people on it, it had anybody who wanted to travel out of the country. And the next train that left Vienna was turned back at the border, and I suppose all the Jewish people ended up in concentration camps. But we didn't know that at the time, of course. I do remember that train journey a bit. The one thing I remember of the train journey is some official, was it a soldier, somebody wearing some sort of uniform, certainly a Nazi employee of some sort, coming round and feeling the hems of our clothes, because we were only allowed to take a definite small sum of money with us, and they felt the hems of our clothes to see if we'd sewn any money into them, or jewellery perhaps. We were allowed to take a small amount each, but no more. So that was a bit, I know, as a little girl, I was both interested and I think quite frightened by this. We went by train to Holland because I had an aunt who'd escaped to Holland long before us, and we wanted to see her, and we stayed with her for a couple of days. And then we took the boat from Holland to England. And again, that was the last boat. This time, not because anybody turned the next one back. So we went from the port, took a train into London. When we got to Paddington, this strange sight met our eyes. The platform where we got off was lined with children. Absolutely lined with children. And of course we found out later that that was the evacuees leaving London as we were coming in. So eventually we got to our house in Kilburn. I went to bed. I think it was fairly late by that time in the evening. And what I do remember is next morning when I woke up, I came downstairs and there were all the adults, and the people whose house it was still there. Later on they left and my family stayed in the house on our own. There were all the adults gathered round the radio. No televisions in those days. So I joined them. And the national anthem was played. And this is a strange thing to me, that everybody, that the English inhabitants, owners of that house, stood up. So my family thought that's the thing to do, I guess. So we all stood up. And Then I thought, oh, this must be an English custom. You stand up when this tune's played, and then we sat down again. And the next thing I remember is this voice with a bit of a stutter. Turned out later it was the king, wasn't it? Who's the king with a bit of a stutter, telling us war has been declared on Germany. And of course that's why no more boats left from Holland. No more boats left going anywhere from anywhere unless they were war boats or essential cargo. And there we were in England, and in an England at war. You know, we had a well-appointed flat with, you know, Turkish carpets, crystal chandeliers and all the rest of it. And the Nazis allowed us to pack it all up. I remember this enormous big wooden thing called a lift or something like that. A lift, I think. And that had our possessions in it. And we were told it would be sent on to England. I don't think they were ever intending to send it on to England. But in any case, then the war started and they wouldn't have been able to. So we just had our suitcases. My mother foresaw a pretty thin time in England, and there I was, a growing girl of 9. She had a dressmaker make me a load of clothes, Austrian style, of course, Dirndl kind of little girl's clothes, with all the hems, with deep hems and all the seams all big seams that could be let out. So I was wearing these clothes for years afterwards, and it helped make me look a real freak, I think, to other children, because they were not the kind of clothes English children were wearing, never mind all these funny let-out hems and seams. But anyway, it was a sensible idea, I guess. Well, we never had a place of our own to live in anymore. Never in all my childhood. And my parents never in their lives, had a place of their own. And that house in Kilburn we lived in on our own for a while, because I think the people who owned it moved out because of the war, because the Blitz started soon after, of course. So London was pretty dangerous. But then we moved from London out to Reading when the doodlebug started to fall, again living with another theosophist. And we lived in a very cramped little flat, the 3 of us in her little flat. And just never... And also we were very poor. We just scraped by. My father wasn't allowed to work for a long time as an immigrant, and also got interned and sent to the Isle of Man as an enemy, being an enemy alien. Not sure how long for. So we sort of lived hand to mouth a bit. Very different. A very different life. I do remember the Blitz, yeah. And first of all, the government issued to everybody who had a garden, they issued sheets of corrugated tin and told us to build Anderson shelters. And I actually remember helping my dad build one of them. Airplanes came over every night. There was a air raid siren. Ooh, ooh, and off we went into the Anderson shelter. Because you could hear everything in the Anderson shelter. You could hear the bombs dropping. Whee! And then a big explosion. And every time she heard a bomb dropping anywhere nearby, my mum used to scream. And this got my dad down after a while. So we decided to abandon the Anderson shelter, and we travelled to some tube station, quite a deep one. I don't know which one. And I remember that very clearly. We had to kind of huddle behind a line until midnight when trains were still going. And then after midnight we were allowed to spread out. And we took blankets. My mother made a little picnic and a thermos flask. We had a little picnic, sandwich and a drink, and slept on the platform. And then in the dawn, the all clear sounded. Ooh. And off we trooped and never knew whether we'd still find our house standing. As we come up out of the tube, we'd always see kind of half houses shaved away. I remember thinking they looked like dolls' houses when you open the front and you can look right into the rooms. Some houses were completely crumpled, but there were also always some where you'd see sort of half rooms, half a bathroom, half a loo, half a sitting room, with bits hanging over the edges. And we never knew till we got to our road whether our house still be standing or not. And of course there were barely any children. There were no schools in London. All the schools had shut. And the children had gone out into the country. There were a few children left. I remember, sheltering in the tube. It was barely any children, mostly adults. So I never got together with any children in that time, and I never went to school at that time. After the Germans had captured France, they were that nearer to England, and they were able to send over what we called the doodlebugs. The doodlebugs could come over from France, maybe from Holland, I'm not sure where, probably France. They could come over and they could set them to land in London, although not set them very accurately where in London. So these random explosives would come over any time. You couldn't have an air raid siren. They'd come, and they weren't confined to the night. They'd come over any time and land anywhere. So my mother appealed through the Theosophical Society for somebody outside London to put us up, and that's when we moved to Reading in Berkshire. And that's also when I started to go to school again, still wearing my funny dirndl let-out clothes. I must have been just below secondary age, because my first school was a primary, and then I went to secondary, but I wasn't in that first school very long, so I must have been just coming up to 11. So I got to England when I was 9, and then got to Reading when I was 10 and a half, and never left till I left home to go to college at 18. But in Reading, at some point, I showed all kinds of signs of difficulty, and they found me a refugee hostel to live in. And I don't know how long I lived there. I think probably a couple of years. And that was quite good. That was quite a good experience, living with other, mainly girls, who'd come from immigrant girls Well, my father had started in life as a watchmaker, and he got watchmake. You know, in those days they weren't battery watches and clocks; they were all wind-ups. And when they went wrong, you'd have, this was a real trade. You could people learnt how it all worked, how all these little tiny weeny little cogs all fitted together to make a watch tick. And that's how my father started out, and that was his trade. And so he worked his way up. And whether he just saved up all the money or whether he got left some, I don't know. So that he eventually, before we left Vienna, he never did any watch mending himself anymore. He had employees. He had a couple, I remember them, nice young, at least one of them I remember, who was always joked around with me as a little girl. And he was a nice young man. My father apparently was a very good, kind employer, but he didn't do watchmaking himself anymore. But when we came to England, when he was finally allowed to work, he got a job in a little shop, much smaller and less well appointed than our old shop in Vienna, but that did watch. He got a job as a watchmaker and went back to his old trade. And of course it was very poorly paid, and he also took in watches to mend in the evenings and weekends, and I used to see him with his eyeglass clamped into his eyes, poring over these tiny weeny little cogs all spread about, little brushes and things to oil to dust these little cogs off, and to brush them very faintly with oil, and then fit the watch all together again. Such a painstaking job. So teeny weeny little things, and taking some real concentration. So he was, and he was a. I remember him in my childhood being, taking me for walks, going round the countryside, being a really good man, and also very fond of me and spent a lot of time with me. Once we came to England, it just took all his energy just to keep going, and he wasn't accessible to me anymore once we came to England, really. Especially once we came to Reading and he started work again. In Reading, all those years in Reading from 11 to 18, that was a really hard time for me. Living with this woman who didn't like me and no longer having good contact with my father, and having very difficult kind of contact with my mother. That's another story.